April 18th, 1955, representatives from 29 nations gather in Indonesia to challenge colonialism and promote peaceful coexistence. 70 years on, we look at the impact of the Bandung Conference, then and now. Hello, I'm Naidu, and this is The Heat. It was 70 years ago this week when 29 nations from Asia and Africa gathered for the historic Bandung Conference to chart a new path for developing countries. Recognized as a milestone in fostering global solidarity, the meeting championed the fight against European colonialism while promoting peaceful coexistence and non-alignment at a time of the Cold War. CGTN's Yasser Hakim takes a look at Bandung's legacy in Egypt and the rest of Africa.
Since the first Bandung Conference held 70 years ago, Egypt has been one of the active members of the group, which in its inauguration included 29 countries that accounted for about 54% of the global population at the time. The conference was organized by Indonesia, Myanmar, India, Sri Lanka, and Pakistan. The African nations that participated in the conference were Egypt, Ethiopia, Ghana, Liberia, Libya, and Sudan.
Egypt was a member of the Bandung Conference and has been eager for 70 years to submit initiatives and proposals that maintain the role of the conference as a means of Afro-Asian cooperation against Western colonialism.
The Bandung Initiative has served Egypt's policies and goals since day one.
Former Egyptian President Jamal Abdel Nasser had been adamant to make the Bandung Conference a success, especially with its role in the creation of the non-alignment movement, decolonization and independence from the West for many Arab and African countries, inspired by the 1952 Nasser Resolution.
The African nations have also been members of the Bandung Group from the beginning. The Asian African grouping had since aided the development of the African continent.
Bandung played a pivotal role in Africa's economic, social and political development. Africa benefits from cooperation with the more developed Asian countries, mainly China, then Japan, Vietnam, Malaysia, the Asian nations.
The Bandung Conference created a legacy in the continent that is still being felt today.
Bandung was a political conference, but its legacy is apparent as it expanded to the non-alignment movement and then the 77 group plus China, covering political, economic, social and even religious issues. The members grew from 29 to 120 countries and became the second largest institution after the UN in the number of member states.
The Afro-Asian Gathering celebrates its 70th anniversary this month in the midst of volatility from Western economic powers. This sheds light on the importance of such organizations in maintaining South-South unity and cooperation. Yes, Hakim for CGTN, Cairo, Egypt.
And joining us now is historian, journalist and executive director of the Transcontinental Institute for Social Research, Vijay Prashad. Vijay, great to have you with us.
Nice to be with you. Thanks a lot.
Now, Vijay, the Bandung Conference was the first time in modern history that the Global South got together to articulate its vision, its economic and political vision outside of Western dominance, outside of the Cold War. In a recent interview, you said they all gathered together because they understood their unity was very important, not only to create a new trade and development order, but also to fight for peace. Bandung represented hope for hundreds of millions of people around the planet in 1955. Take us back to that time, 1955, how it came together and why that was so important then and now.
It's really important to understand and also appreciate the fact that hundreds of millions of people in the first half of the 20th century were fighting for their humanity. They were fighting for their dignity, whether this was in Asia or in Africa. They were fighting against colonialism. They were fighting against fascism. They were fighting against the domination of their lives by somebody else. And this was hundreds of millions of people mobilized into the struggle. It's very important to recognize that. They came from different political perspectives. You know, the movements that carried these hundreds of millions were not all identical. There was the Chinese Revolution on the one side, a communist revolution. From China came Zhou Enlai to Bandung. On the other side, you know, there were anti-communists like Sir John Kotalavala, or there were others who came with different views. Nehru from India, a Fabian socialist, different political views. But they all knew a couple of things. Number one, that they had to stand together if they were able to build a world of peace and development. And secondly, they understood that to build this world of peace and development, they needed to collaborate because most of these countries simply didn't have the resources to develop themselves. Their resources had been stolen from them. They didn't have the wealth. They didn't have the technology. When the British were finally thrown out of India, the literacy rate was only 12%. So they needed each other to share skills, to share expertise, you know, to have understanding as they move forward to build a new world. So this unity at Bandung was really crucial.
So as you say, Vijay, these were people of diverse views, of diverse ideologies that came together in Bandung. In fact, at the end of the conference, the communique published then called for the, quote, promotion of mutual interests and cooperation. Now, if you look at it, decades after all the efforts that have been made by the Global South, what are the tangible, meaningful changes that we have seen?
Well, it's important to be a little practical about this and not to be too nostalgic or naive. On the one hand, real institutions were created by the Bandung Project. You wouldn't have had the non-aligned movement without the Bandung spirit. You wouldn't have had the UN Conference on Trade and Development without the Bandung spirit. I would actually make the argument that you might not have had the kind of arms control regime that was forced upon the United States, its NATO allies, and the Soviet Union by the Third World Bloc. It was after the non-aligned movement that leaders from these countries went to Moscow, went to Washington and said, come to Geneva and start negotiating a drawdown of the nuclear posture. You wouldn't have had all that. You know, the discussion of peace might not have been so fundamentally on the agenda. But more actually to go forward. I mean, it was a consequence of an attack on these governments, this project, through the coup d'etats of the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and then the debt crisis in the 80s, that the project was deeply weakened. But now you're beginning to see a return, not of the project, because people aren't really talking at the highest level about Bandung, except in a very matter-of-fact way or a formal way. But you're seeing objective changes taking place. You're seeing greater South-South trade as a consequence of the collapse of the markets in the North, the collapse of demand in the United States, countries like China trading more with Latin America, with Africa, India trading more with Africa. You see greater South-South trade. You're beginning to see greater South-South political solidarity. So in a sense, the spirit of Bandung is sort of haunting the present, even if people aren't talking about Bandung as much as they should.
Right, and it's a point that you have made in the past as well. I mean, if we take a grouping like BRICS, which is now known as BRICS Plus, 11 countries are now in this expanded grouping, looking at the additions to the original group. I mean, there are some who describe BRICS Plus as a revival, as some revival of the Bandung spirit, but you have said that it would be misleading to suggest that the Bandung spirit is alive and well. So how do you see it today?
Well, let's be quite clear. You know, after the subprime market collapsed in the United States, there was a serious demand failure in the United States, in many European countries. They simply were not capable of buying the goods and services being sold by countries growing at a fast clip like China, Vietnam, India, Bangladesh, Indonesia, and so on. And these countries began to look at each other, look towards South Africa, look at Brazil, and say, look, we're in a problem. We have a system organized to sell goods and services to Western countries. Their markets don't seem to have the capacity. We're going to start having to sell these goods and services to each other. And that's exactly what the BRICS first was created to do, so that India, Brazil, South Africa, these countries would sell to each other. There'd be more business opportunities and so on. The politics of the BRICS was not really in the lead. After all, these countries also had very different kinds of political orientations. For a time, Brazil was led by a right-wing government, Jair Bolsonaro. India has been led by a right-wing government, Mr. Narendra Modi's government. China is, of course, led by the Communist Party. Very different political orientations, but they're united on a trade agenda. This has actually increased further with the development of China's Belt and Road project, which has brought very many countries into the orbit of this trade, a new kind of South-South trade development. It's important to understand when we say BRICS Plus, a lot of the plus countries are countries that are oil and natural gas producers. You had the addition of Saudi Arabia, Iran, the UAE. You put them together with Russia, which is part of OPEC Plus, the other plus. You basically have the largest oil producers in the global south in BRICS Plus. This remains a trade and development project. It's not yet taken on a political tone. It's not yet been able to fashion a common political argument about, for instance, trying to stop the growth of the use of war to solve political disputes. I mean, the expansion of NATO, for instance, hasn't fundamentally and frontally been challenged by a platform such as the BRICS Plus. So we may be coming eventually to some sort of common political understandings, but I again don't feel like we should exaggerate what the BRICS is capable of doing. It has taken up the economic aspects of Bandung, but not the wider political and cultural aspects, which were very central to the Bandung project in 1955.
So, Vijay, we just got a couple of minutes left. You know, if we look at Bandung, it was born from the challenges of grappling with the legacies of European colonialism, of imperialism at that time. Now, today you write, and I'm quoting you here again, you say, after many decades of stasis, we see the growth of what we are calling a new mood in the global south. Yet this mood is not the same as a spirit. It is merely a hint of a new possibility. What is that hint of a new possibility?
Well, let's take the example of the genocide in Gaza. You know, we have had many countries, South Africa, Bolivia, Colombia, and so on, go to the International Court of Justice led by South Africa to say this is a genocide, it's outrageous, and so on. Many countries have put on the table their dissatisfaction with what is happening in Gaza, but nobody can do anything beyond that. They have not been able to, for instance, unilaterally break ties with Israel or break ties with arms dealers and arms companies that are fueling the genocide. So what we have is a new mood. Country like South Africa can go to the International Court of Justice, but it's not willing to break with selling coal to Israel, for instance, at the same time. That would be a spirit. That would be a different kind of attitude. We don't see that yet. We don't see the kind of clarity and confidence of the global south in saying, we're just not going to deal with a genocidal country. Until that happens, I would just characterize this as a mood and not a full-blown spirit.
Okay, Vijay, that's where we have to leave it. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks a lot.
There is much to talk about. Let's get to our panel. Einar Tangen is a senior fellow at the Taihe Institute and founder of Asian Narratives on Substack. Sanusha Naidu is an associate at the University of Cape Town's Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance. And Gita Wirjawan served as the Indonesian Trade Minister. He's currently a visiting scholar at Stanford University. Thanks, everyone, for being with us. Gita, let me start with you. Indonesia's founding president, Sukarno, he described this gathering, the Bandung Gathering, as the first intercontinental conference of colored peoples in the history of mankind. It emphasized sovereignty and non-aggression and the promotion of mutual interests. When you look at today's geopolitical challenges, have those goals stood the test of time?
I think to a large extent, those have been achieved. If we go back to 1955, the GDP per capita of Indonesia and that of China would have been less than $200, and that of Egypt would have been around $500. That of India would have been around $300. In the last 70 years, things have changed. 1955, I think the spirit of the Bandung Conference would have been to convey the message of anti-colonialism and anti-neocolonialism. But also there was, I think, a more important agenda item, which would have been the desire to create some sort of a peace and security architecture that would provide, the necessary peaceful coexistence between China and India at that time, and also the peaceful coexistence between China and the US. And the last bit, I think the equally important agenda item at that time would have been to make sure that, the voice of the 29 nations that attended in Bandung in April of 1955 would be heard and consulted by the two superpowers then, which I think in the view of most, if not all, members that attended the conference, were not consulting with these nations. Fast forward to today, the economic contour has changed. The geopolitical contour has changed. We have the ability to exert a lot more voice, to exercise and expand upon, our strategic autonomy, and we've moved up the value chain and geopolitical global order in a big way in the last 70 years. So I can speak for Indonesia or Southeast Asia, which is roughly 700 million people in the region and a $4 trillion economy. I think the earlier or original message that would have been conveyed not only by Sukarno, but by Chou En-lai, Nasser, and Nehru has reverberated in a good way to this point where all members of Southeast Asia, most members of the Global South, I think, have a much bigger say in where the peace and security architecture would have to go, but also the economic and cultural architecture for the world would have to go forward.
Sanusha, the historians who say that Bandung had a profound psychological impact on Africa, we have to remember at that time when this conference took place in 1955, that there were still many countries who were still being colonized. In the years following the conference, from 1955 to 1964, 35 countries on the continent of Africa declared their independence. Could you give us a sense of how Bandung and the goals that were discussed there and the principles that were discussed there reinvigorated so many countries in their quest for freedom?
I think very much so on the basis of this idea of peace, solidarity, independence, but also to be able to find their political identity. I mean, I think Kwame Nkrumah made the very profound statement at the dawn of independence in Ghana, where he spoke about seeking your political kingdom first, and then, of course, all else will follow. And that's a paraphrase of that quote. And I think that was the spirit of Bandung and the spirit of that conference and that kind of independence with regard to not being aligned to any of the so-called Cold War blocs, between the USA and the Soviet Union, kind of reverberated within the African context and found that kind of inspiration towards independence and the kind of decolonization. But again, in the continent, I think structural conditions have moved in terms of where they are now. And of course, that spirit of political independence kind of found a challenging environment in terms of the economic architecture. And countries in Africa, whether in Southern Africa in particular, from looking at it from that perspective, got caught up in the Cold War dynamics of competition, rivalry, and the kind of geopolitical architecture that kind of unveiled itself at the time. And so we do see in Africa that the spirit of Bandung is felt, but I think from the economic perspective that was commented earlier by my fellow panelists, I think you're still beginning to see that level of economic strategic dynamic architecture is still kind of finding its footing in the continent if you look at intra-African trade and the integration of the African economy into the global economic architecture.
Okay, Einar Tangen, the Bandung Conference also opened up the era of South-South cooperation, economic cooperation, that is. President Sukarno's opening address was titled, "Let a New Asia and a New Africa Be Born." What can you tell us about how China has lived up to that goal over the past several decades? You know, the post-World War II, the decades when we saw many countries become independent as well.
Well, you know, the key factor of what you just said is independent. China was emerging, 1949, it's founded. It has tremendous challenges in front of it. And it wants to develop its own future. It does not want to be dependent, as my colleagues have said, about on this colonial architecture that it had just freed itself from. So China is, you know, has been showing that the way to political independence is going to depend on economic independence, that you have to start developing your economy, and that happened during the Reform and Open Up period in you know, very rapid succession. China showed the world that there was a place for developing South-South countries, economies, and it has been literally at the heart of areas like Southeast Asia, you know, the trade flows. It's not a coincidence that Southeast Asia, I mean, ASEAN is the #1 trading partner for China. So, I mean, it was at that time this desire not to be the grass that was under the feet of the elephants that were fighting. But the question is, how did you achieve that with so many of the cards being held by the colonial powers? And I think China, as I said, has been the example of how you get that done.
And I know, would it be fair to say that that kind of bloc mentality that existed at the height of the Cold War, and which conferences like Bandung tried to counter, is now something of the past?
Well, I don't know that I think so. I mean, instead of having two countries who are trying to, you know, colonize the world, you have one. The United States, you know, literally putting unilateral tariffs on 180 countries. You know, I don't know how else you can put that except a, you know, colonial putsch. But in terms of groupings, you have had new groupings: ASEAN, all right, BRICS, SCO. The Belt and Road Initiative. But these have not been ideological. They have been about trade, about development. And as I said initially, the key to the future of your political independence a lot of times depend on your ability to be economically independent.
Gita, in today's world, of course, we see some countries that are looking inward, shifting away from multilateralism, shifting away from globalization as well. Joanne Lin of the Ishak Institute in Singapore, she said this, and I'm quoting her, she said, "In today's multipolar world, countries like Indonesia see greater value in engaging with flexible coalitions that deliver results while still upholding the spirit of strategic autonomy that the non-aligned movement originally championed." Are those principles still very strong today, or are they under threat?
I think they're richer and stronger as of today. I think it's important to look back to 1955. The bipolarity between the Soviet Union and the US was undeniable. There was no conversation that ever referred to any kind of unipolarity nor multipolarity. Fast forward to the last few years until today, multipolarity is undeniable. And this is on the back of the kind of revisionism that's been exerted by countries that would have been very tiny decades ago, but have become larger, call it China, India, Indonesia, and most parts of Southeast Asia. Now, Southeast Asia, again, with 700 million people and a $4 trillion economy, being the largest trading partner of China as of 2024, should have a say, should have the kind of option value that's warranted to any large-scale region or country. So the ability for Southeast Asia to tie up with the West, whether it's through the APEC or the CPTPP, to tie up with China and its grouping through BRICS or BRI, I think is a manifestation of the kind of optionality that a large region like Southeast Asia deserves. And I think the way forward is some kind of a multipolarity that's going to be a bit more structured, where there's going to be a better definition of who's likely to be an ally of the US, who's likely to be a swing state, and who's likely to be a rival of the US. And I do believe that Southeast Asia have the optionalities as to deal with both China and the West.
Sanusha, what do you make of current geopolitical tensions? We have the tariff and trade wars, we've got protectionist barriers going up. Gita just spoke about structured multipolarity. I mean, is that threatened?
Well, I think to a large extent, what you're really seeing is the question around how non-alignment has also evolved in the context of where we were in 1955 and where we are in 2025, the 70-year anniversary of that spirit of Bandung. So I think this whole question around structure and that kind of issues around the multipolarity really raises the question around what is strategic alignment within this context and the contours of the current international system. The current international system has actually now opened up the levels of tensions, and not just geopolitical and geostrategic tensions, but also regional tensions around how in the context of Africa, how different regions, different regional economic blocs are also striving to deal and address these kinds of strategic alignment with regard to with each other, but also with the global architecture and the actors. So I think what is interesting for us, if you look at the whole question of non-alignment, for me, and from where I sit in South Africa, is that that contestation between what does a non-alignment mean and what does strategic alignment mean, because this has been the big debate for us in terms of the economic cooperation, but how does that then get underpinned by the issues that are now basically being put out there in the context of the UN Security Council and tensions around the WTO and so forth.
Einar Tangen, I've just got a couple of minutes left. The post-World War II period was a tumultuous period in modern history. I mean, we saw the two major superpowers engage in a Cold War, which was actually a hot war in many countries in the global South. And we saw these major moves towards ending colonialism. To what extent did the Bandung Conference, influence that course of history?
Well, it was there, but it was unformed. It was ideas, countries kind of striking out, trying to figure out what they can do. I disagree a little bit with my colleagues. I think this idea that the switch is on and off, that you're aligning with one group or another group, I think that really belongs to the past. What you had was the U.S. Waging an ideological war against what they perceived as the enemy, socialism and communism. Today, it's really, I think, been replaced by what China is proposing, which is these three principles that, countries need to be secure, they need to have a path to development, and they need to be respected. And that is the key going forward. It's not choosing any particular ally or anything like this. It is simply choosing for your own country what can be best going forward.
Right. Okay, and that is where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Naidu in Washington.